Welcome to Living Better with Dr. Russ, presented by NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310. Every Saturday from 11 a.m. to 12 noon, co-hosts Dr. Russ Ferstandig and Lou Russo will cover everything you need to know to keep you and your whole family happy and healthy. Now, here's Dr. Russ and Lou with Living Better with Dr. Russ.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Living Better on NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310. Dr. Russ Ferstandig is here. I'm Lou Russo. Great to have you with us. Dr. Russ, good morning.
Good morning, Lou.
Welcome back. We have a very special show for you today. It's going to be ripped from this week's headlines, and it's some amazing stories that people just can't stop talking about. So we'll get to all of that in a second. First, let's give a brief overview for new listeners to the show on what Living Better is all about, what we're trying to accomplish, and how we're trying to accomplish it.
Yeah, living better basically is what the name says. Each of us, goes through however many days we have on this earth, and presumably the more good days we have, the better our life is. And so this show is about things that you might do to help make each day more enjoyable. And that could be something as simple as helping you understand why some of the things that happen around you or to you are happening that don't make sense. Might be troubling if you didn't understand them, and even if you didn't like the actual event, if you could make some sense out of it, it might be it might give you some sense of peace. And since to a lot of people, other people don't make sense, a lot of this is understanding human behavior. And those of you who have heard previous shows know that we've established what we call a string of pearls. These are basic truths that that apply to just about every human being. And those pearls are fundamental things that they're rules, they're kind of modes of conduct that if you look at the specifics of something that's going on in somebody's life, kind of gives you the basis for why that's happening. And so we're trying to help people make sense out of what seems like a lot of unpredictable, maybe wacky, or just doesn't make sense behavior. And unfortunately, I'm sure any of you who have turned on radio or television since the end of last week knows that we have a very troubling event that is very topical in the news.
I mean, we of course are talking about the Germanwings airplane tragedy, and it was amazing because as that story unfolded, there were so many things, even all of us here at a distance from where the tragedy took place. As the details unfolded about this story, I became more and more frightened at the prospect of what it is that was behind this crash. And, initially you wonder if it's some kind of mechanical issue that was going on. And, of course, everyone who lived
and we kind of wanted it to be a
right.
mechanical issue, which, if you think about it in and of itself, is who wants to think that these things we trust our lives to have mechanical issues.
Right. Well, because the other options were even more horrifying, possibly terrorist issues or possibly intentionally crashing this plane, which, as we learn more and more about it, turns out that seems more and more likely to be the case. And then to find out that there were some mental health issues regarding the co-pilot of this plane, it just opens up just a world of questions and a world of concerns. And for those of us who, if you've been listening, you know that I don't travel by air, makes somebody like me wonder in so many different ways. But for those who travel on a regular basis, it just adds this chilling thought of this possibility that it's out there. Not that this hasn't happened before, but so rarely that it's not really something that you think of all the time. I know that you have never spent any time with this particular person who was the co-pilot of this plane, but people have a lot of questions about what could possibly be going through the mind of someone in that situation. The responsibility of having 150 people or so as your responsibility. Can you shed some light for the average person like myself on what could have possibly happened here?
Well, let's first get something straight. while it's particularly graphic and tragic that the man was a pilot, a co-pilot on an airplane, and this plane came down out of the skies and basically disintegrated, the fundamental problem here, the way this guy was thinking, the relative sense of control that he had in a scenario where he could influence other people's lives, that happens to every one of us every day. It happens to us hundreds, if not thousands of times a day, every time we get in a car.
Sure.
We assume as we're driving on a road, that a crossroad that has a red light, that the person is going to respect that. Most of us never do. We assume that the average person behind the wheel is responsible. We assume that the people we pass in a mall are not going to attack us. So on some level, what we're really talking about here, and I will answer your question, but on the most fundamental level, what we're talking about here is personal control. You know, it's hard to understand what makes humans work. Why do we conduct ourselves the way we do? Nobody's been able to explain that. The smartest scientists in the world have not been able to come up with that. But yet, the reality is, considering how many people are on the face of the earth and how many problems, and as ugly as things like ISIS is and wars and whatever, people basically conduct themselves in a reasonably, quote-unquote, civilized manner. So when we see somebody who does something that seems so out of the realm, as you just asked, it begs the question, why? You know, if you go back, if you've been around for the pearls of wisdom, you know the first one is perception is reality. And unfortunately, one of the things that, you know, we talk about when people are depressed, how their mood is down. But what really matters is how they are seeing the world around them, and perhaps even more importantly, how they perceive the upcoming future. It is very clear, assuming that what's being leaked, and by the way, there's questions about the accuracy of what's being leaked thus far, that this co-pilot had some real sort of long-standing negative feelings about where life was going. Now, it's interesting because you see these videos of him flying a glider and being, and you know, just loving it. But then it seemed there was a very dark side, where he had a hard time, for who knows what reason, had a hard time dealing with the fact that life could be okay. And I know when you and I first talked about this, you said, well, it's one thing for him to be depressed, but what about those other 149 people who were on the airplane? And my answer to you, and once again, purely speculation, because as you said, I have no direct contact with this, it's entirely possible that he really didn't weigh the impact on the other 149 very much. In other words, you know, there are some people, unfortunately, who derive pleasure from murder.
Right.
That may not be the role with this guy at all. He may have just been so negative in his own feelings. Maybe crashing the plane was some way that made sense to him, that somebody would know that he existed, because otherwise maybe he saw himself as a nobody and nobody would care. Bottom line is, we don't know, but we do know one thing, is that sense of personal control that we all want to believe resides within us wasn't residing within him on that day. And even more unfortunately, sounds like it wasn't residing within him for a number of days prior. And it sounds to me like the system had some quote-unquote safeguards that allowed that to go unchecked.
Right. Just to try to draw a parallel, and again, it's all speculation, but someone who contemplates suicide, Is it true that more often than not, they're not thinking about how that action, if they do take it, will affect their family, friends, and loved ones? Is there any parallel to be drawn as we try to understand how, if all of the reports are true, how that many lives were taken by this one person's decision? Is there a parallel between someone who contemplates suicide not considering how their family will feel about it to this co-pilot contemplating suicide and not relating to what will happen to the rest of the people with him?
Yeah, I think it's a continuum. First of all, I'm going to make a bold statement. Probably just about everybody at some point in time, however quick, however trivial, ask themselves the question, is life worth living? Because we all have crises that overwhelm us. And, in the moment, it's like, I want to go dig a hole and go hide. Obviously, there are a lot of people where the thought is not so infrequent, and it becomes a bigger issue. My answer to your question, Lou, is because I am a member of the camp that says the person who suicides is the one who got away with it easy. Okay, maybe it was painful, maybe it was whatever, and of course we have no idea about what the afterlife is about, but presumably there's some finality. It's just beginning for their survivors. And in fact, if you look at what happens to survivors of suicide, their lives get turned upside down. So I personally think that there's people who have the transient thoughts of suicide, however grounded. And, oh, by the way, since we talk about drugs a lot, since drugs distort how you think and what seems real and how you project the future, most mind-altering drugs will increase those kinds of thoughts. And so, I've been of the position for a long time that a lot of the quote-unquote opiate overdoses are really suicides that get reported as overdoses because you don't know what's really going on. But I think there are a lot of people who are feeling very down. And if they felt there would be no survivors to be hurt, might actually take action. So in some ways, that conscience that you're talking about actually is a preventative for some. Then when it gets worse, to where the person is so involved with themselves that they don't care about anybody else. They don't care about the other 449 people who were in that plane. They don't care about who they may hit on the ground. They don't care about any of the extended family. That is a person who is so out of touch with reality that to some extent in their mind, the population of the world is one, and it's them. And then you're in that scenario where consequences don't matter. It's all about me.
So for that person observing this horrific story and trying to come to terms with the fact that not only did this person, again, if the stories are all true, take his own life, but took the lives of 149 others, it is possible that those other 149 people, even though his job was to care for those people during the time that they were on the plane, it is possible that their presence didn't factor one way or another into his decision?
I think not only is it possible, I think we've heard from the cockpit recorder, that throughout this process, as this plane is descending, as it sounds like apparently it even the wing clipped a peak, there was no change. They said they could hear this guy's breathing. There was no change in his rate of breathing. That says to me that he was somewhat out of tune with his external surroundings and was totally within his head. So, while of course we'll never know exactly what he was thinking, I think it's a pretty good bet at that moment, like I said, he was the only person in his world. There was no awareness and therefore no need for conscience.
And it would be normal for someone observing this to have a hard time comprehending that that's possible.
It would be, I would say, essentially impossible for somebody who didn't share this perception. We talk about people being crazy, or we talk about, if we're going to use more technical terms, psychotic, meaning you can't sort real from unreal, or delusions, the kinds of beliefs that come out of that. This was a man who was so depressed that for all intensive purposes, at the moments of this act, he was out of touch with the reality that we all live in. Once again, back to that pearl. We all can look at the same thing. We all see it differently. He maybe saw this. You'll see people who, as they're about to commit suicide, have a huge grin on their face because they're going, relief is coming my way.
We're going to continue this important discussion and apply potentially some things we can all learn from it as we continue with Living Better. Coming up next.
New Jersey is known as the Garden State, and for good reason. Our local farms are major producers of tomatoes, bell peppers, cucumbers, snap beans, spinach, and squash, as well as blueberries, cranberries, peaches, and so much more. Eating these and other healthy foods are a great way for you to help fight chronic disease and increase your overall health. Some of the benefits of eating right include an increased energy level and decreased risk for diabetes. So this summer, take advantage of being able to call New Jersey home and eat more of the great fruits and vegetables grown right here in the one and only Garden State. Being healthy never tasted so good. For more information, go to njpn.org. That's njpn.org. This message sponsored by the Coalition for a Healthy New Jersey with funding provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the New Jersey Broadcasters Association, and this station.
Distracted driving is a dangerous epidemic on New Jersey's roadways. Driver inattention has been a major contributing factor in more than 1.4 million motor vehicle crashes in the state during the last decade. And every year in New Jersey, more than 150 lives are lost because motorists did not pay attention to their primary task, driving. Hello, this is New Jersey Acting Attorney General John Hoffman with an important reminder about driving safety. This month, law enforcement agencies throughout the state will be targeting distracted drivers and issuing tickets to drivers using a handheld device like a cell phone. First-time violators of this law face a fine of $200 plus court costs. Subsequent violations can cost you between $400 and $800 and result in a 90-day license suspension and 3 insurance points. I'm urging everyone listening now to put down the phone and just drive because, simply put, there is no phone conversation that is worth your life.
This message sponsored by the New Jersey Division of Highway Traffic Safety, the New Jersey Broadcasters Association, and this station.
You're listening to Living Better with Dr. Russ. Hear everything you'll need to know about handling the health of mind and body for yourself and your family. Now, back to Dr. Russ and Lou Russo.
We are back with another edition of Living Better. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Russ Ferstandig is here. I'm Lou Russo. We've been talking about the Germanwings tragedy in the first segment of the show today. It's a tragedy that, based on the sheer number of people we lost and the way it seems like, or it's being reported, the way it happened, it is mind-boggling to so many people and so difficult to understand. And from everyone who doesn't fly and just sees it as a sheer tragedy to those who fly all the time and now have to question something they probably never questioned before, it certainly isn't on the mind of all of us. And Dr. Russ, what doesn't help that situation is, as you follow this story in the news cycle, you literally are bombarded with the story wherever you turn and for long lengths of time. So it's very difficult not to think about. But we really will all reach a point, as we do with all news stories, where it begins to dominate the airwaves a little less and less as we go on. But we'll be watching it more sort of from afar than we are right now. Question I have for you today is all of the emotions and all of the things that we're trying to absorb from this story. Is there any way that we can take lessons from this? Are there any parallels between what has happened here and what goes on in our daily lives?
Oh, the lessons and the parallels are huge. I want to recount a personal experience I had, and I don't remember. I've lost track. It was the day after it happened, so maybe that was last Friday, I was watching the morning news. And, of course, it was, this airplane had mysteriously crashed and everybody was dead. And, of course, that always is newsworthy. And I was watching, and I know a little bit about airplanes and trying to figure out what happened. And then there was a news flash and said, not a normal crash. This was not a mechanical failure, which somewhat we're kind of fatalistic. We kind of accept that happens, but that this was a human act. And I remember, even though I make my living as a psychiatrist, at the second that came across, because I hadn't considered that, probably most people hadn't,
right,
the story totally changed. Now, without a doubt, there were still 150 people dead. There were still God knows how many people whose lives have been turned upside down. But now that it went from a mechanical failure to an act of human irrational, out of control, we didn't know, totally different story. So, to me, the question is, do things like that happen in our daily lives? Even on, granted, not nearly as graphically as 150 people dying, but do they happen? Are there lots of those little things that happen during the day that by the end of the day have a profound influence on how we put our day together and thus impact the quality of our life? And if you've been with us on previous shows, one of our big things is helping you understand what happens around you so that it isn't quite as unknown. It isn't quite as puzzling. It doesn't seem quite, pardon me for using the word, as crazy or irrational. And so in that sense, it's a direct parallel between what happens in our lives. And since we talk a lot about drug use and unfortunately opiate use, which can cause an almost instantaneous, literally in a matter of minutes, personality transformation from somebody you've known for 20, 30, 40 years, and you're looking at them and saying, to all external evidence, looks the same, but there's nothing about this person that I can relate to, and I can't predict their behaviors. If you took some of the words out of what I just said, did I not just describe what the news is now saying about the co-pilot?
Sure.
He seemed fine. All of the standard German testing procedures, some of which probably should be modified, he passed. Until they went into his apartment, everybody said he seemed fine. And then yet this happened, and we don't know how to deal with that. So is there a lesson? Yeah, the lesson is we need to remember that what we see on the surface is not always what's going on inside. And then in the face of all this darkness, there's some good news. If we do know about somebody being troubled, fortunately, we have tools, we have individuals with training that we can help some of these people out of these very dark spaces. And that's really kind of some of what I'd like to talk about, because as much as we have those tools and as much as we have huge numbers of mental health workers, more mental health workers than we have substance workers at this point, you know what, as a society, we're not real eager to turn towards them. And even a lot of my colleagues in medicine, in the non-mental health part of medicine, they're not eager to even make referrals for fear of the negative repercussions. What will my patient think of me? Even if with their interests at heart, I say you should go see a psychiatrist. Not to mention that medical school is woefully inadequate in teaching the mental health part of things. So there's a huge connection.
Now, we talk all the time, and really one of the goals of this program is to open the doors of communication when it comes to mental health issues, because it can lead to so many negative things in our lives. Last week's show, as an example, we were talking about my fear of flying, and I will tell you, I'll be honest about it, when we talked about it and talked about it as a mental health issue, I literally leaned back in my chair almost because I was falling right into that sort of stigma thing where
and you also seemed to me you had a knot in your stomach because suddenly just as the airplane story changed when we heard the pilot had a hand in it,
right.
When suddenly the term mental health got applied, your whole thing of I couldn't go to Barbados took on a different meaning.
Absolutely. And it's I think it's based on sort of society's use of the words and how we all seem to think when we hear those words. Question is, when something like this happens, when something so appalling to people and so tragic happens, and we are looking at someone who had some mental health issues, doesn't this just make it even more difficult to leave that door of communication open? Doesn't it just add to that stereotype? Don't you feel like that it can hurt the leaving of those doors open?
Of course it does, and for a long time that I feel the critical first step in making a dent in our substance abuse problem in Ocean and Monmouth counties, or anywhere for that matter, is for us to be more accepting that it happened, to remember that there still is a good person inside. Because we're not comfortable with these things, we tend to go black-white. This pilot, who could have been a hero, quote unquote, in the news spin, trying to save these people, suddenly became a murderer. When I'm going to guess, obviously I don't know, that he was so wrapped up in his own troubles that he was oblivious to the fact that there were another 149 people behind him. And why and how could I say something so preposterous? If he was truly concerned. They keep telling us from the cockpit recorder that his breathing never changed. We all know when we get disturbing thoughts in our minds, our breathing changes. That kind of tells us indirectly this guy was in his own world, probably a psychotic, unreal world. And unfortunately, a bunch of other people and their families were irreparably influenced by this. And I'm not trying to be the voice of doom. I swear I'm not. But this happens to every one of us all day long. And the fact that we can't see it and we can't predict it is so darn scary. We unfortunately choose to ignore it. Or let me take it one step further. We choose to engage in some substance or activity that helps us ignore it. Now, what do people, if you look at what is the definition of entertainment, for a lot of people, the definition of entertainment is a temporary suspension of reality as we know it. Mm-hmm. I go to a casino. I'm not advocating gambling by any stretch. There's no windows. There's no clocks. There's noises. There's all sorts of stuff. For me, I can't stand it. But a lot of people, they just get overloaded by it, and they forget about what the reality of their life is, so that they can spend money they can't afford to spend. Or some people, retail therapy. They love to go shopping. Right. For some people, it's working out, whatever it is. But what we're really talking about here is, can we live a life and be happy while still acknowledging that there's no guarantee about the goodness of life? You got that life throws the good points and life throws bad points. And not that I want to swish this into my three-prong approach, but that third prong, the therapy prong, that I believe is critically important in sustained sobriety, is that people need to accept the reality that life is not always easy, and that when you feel like you can't do it, chances are very strong that you can. It just hurts. And a lot of us are not real good at standing up to the hurt. And yet we've heard from guests we've had on the show before that those who stand up, they all say in their own words essentially the same thing. They come away feeling stronger. So I want to throw this back to you, Lou. Okay, you've seen a plane go down.
Mm-hmm.
You talked last week, and you and I have talked at other times about your fear of flying.
Right.
What has this done? How has this impacted you?
I have what I think is probably a sort of weird reaction to that. You would think that with my fear of flying that this would close any door to the thought that I would ever get on a plane again, because it's so tragic, and it's in my face 24/7 with the news. Everybody's talking about it. My reaction to it, though, oddly enough, is different than that, because over the past couple of weeks, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how my fear of flying doesn't necessarily have to do with the safety of the plane. After all...
So, wait a minute. So, pardon me for interrupting, but here's a pearl again. During the last few weeks, you've been thinking about this more than you normally do.
Sure. Absolutely.
So this has now become a subject that is so uncomfortable to your sense of being that your ability to park it and say, I'll go do my radio show. I'll go do whatever. I'll go shopping. You can't do that as comfortably now. It's forced itself into your consciousness. And so you have a choice.
Right.
I'm going to do something about it because I can't ignore it anymore. Or maybe I'll do something like take some drugs to make it go away. Fortunately, you've chosen the former.
Right. Right. It's something I've been spending a ton of time thinking about. The odd reaction I think I've had to this is I left. My wife got on the plane and went to Barbados where her family was waiting for her, and I stayed behind because I was too afraid to get on the plane. I never once questioned my wife's safety on that plane because I know it's a safe mode of transportation, and I truly believe that.
And nor would you have let her get on the plane if you did question it.
Absolutely. So I've sort of been trying to separate that from my fear of flying. And when this happened and the news covered it so extensively, I actually began to start thinking to myself, this is sort of proof of what I'm talking about, because this plane crash, this terrible tragedy, is such a rare thing in the big grand scheme of things that it even further proves my point of how safe flying is, because they're making such news cycles usually are done in a day, and they've been talking about it for days upon days.
Because they're not talking about the crash. They're talking about the pilot.
The pilot, right, exactly. But in my mind, it further reinforces the fact that it's not about the safety of flying that I'm afraid of. So that was I'm surprised at that reaction, but that's truly how I feel.
So is this going to make it easier for you to go on next year's vacation?
I'm not sure yet. I will tell you it hasn't had a negative impact on that. I don't feel like my thoughts of getting on that plane are more distant now. So the thought that if this doesn't affect me in a negative way, this being in my face, I must be closer to getting on the plane than before. So I hope so. I hope that's the way. We'll all hopefully live it together as it plays out. I'll let you know. But I'm certainly not more afraid to get on a plane than I was before. So I hope that answers the question. All right, we're going to take another break, and we're going to come back. We're going to continue to parallel this terrible tragedy with the crash with everyday life and try to learn whatever we can from it here on NewsTalk Radio.
And in fact, maybe even bring it a little closer to our everyday lives.
And that'll all come up in our next segment on NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310.
Hey, you almost ran me off the road with your truck.
Well, if you weren't in my no zone...
What's a no zone?
Listen, if you're directly behind me, right in front of me, or passing me on the sides, there are points where I can't see you at all. Those are my no zones. Also, if you cut in front of me, I can't stop my 40-ton truck nearly as fast as you can stop your car.
I didn't realize that, but you were driving in the left lane for a pretty long time. You should only be there to pass, so I had to pass you on the right.
I'm sorry about that. I'll try to be more aware to keep right. I know in New Jersey it's illegal to linger in the left lane.
Thanks. I'll be more careful about driving in a truck's no zones and make sure I'm visible when passing.
In 2013 alone, there were almost 5,000 accidents in New Jersey involving large trucks. 61 of those ended in fatalities. Trucks and cars have to share our roads, so let's work together to stop unnecessary accidents and avoid dangerous situations. It's on all of us to reach our destinations safely. This message sponsored by the New Jersey Department of Transportation, the New Jersey Broadcasters Association, and this station. You know how to take care of your stuff. You take your car in for an oil change before the engine seizes up. You put the milk away before it goes bad. You take the trash out before it smells up the house. You know that the best way to take care of a problem is to prevent it from happening in the first place. So what about your health? Did you know that heart disease, diabetes, and stroke are all preventable diseases? Every year, millions of Americans suffer from preventable chronic disease. But it doesn't have to be that way. Getting screened for risk factors helps make sure that you can take steps to prevent these diseases before they become a problem. It's as easy as scheduling a checkup with your doctor or stopping by one of the many local sites that offer free screenings. So take a few minutes and go get checked out. Because while you can fix a car, throw out bad milk, and clean your house, it's a lot harder to come back from chronic disease once you have it. So call your doctor today. For more information on chronic disease, please visit njpn.org. That's njpn.org. This message sponsored by the Coalition for a Healthy New Jersey with funding provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the New Jersey Broadcasters Association, and this station.
Now, back to Living Better with Dr. Russ, with everything you need to know about keeping you and your family healthy and happy. Here's more with Dr. Russ and Lou Russo.
We are back on NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310 with Dr. Russell Ferstandig. It is Living Better. I'm Lou Russo, and the conversation has been dominated by the story of that tragic airplane crash and the co-pilot and his involvement, and the stories that are coming out about how it all came together, frightening and tragic. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to come away from this story as the days pass, as is the case with most news stories. Other things start to come into the news, and that particular story will begin to sort of fade from the headlines. But we want to take what has happened and see if we can apply it to what we do on a daily basis, make the parallels, and try to learn whatever we can from it. So, Dr. Russ, how do we do that in a situation like this?
Well, once again, for those of you who've been watching visual radio, for those of you who've been listening to the show, you know that one of our themes on the show is that there's fundamental rules about human behavior that you can see all sorts of examples of. And as sad and as tragic as this plane crash is, this is no exception to that guideline. This thing made us think about something we would prefer not to think about, namely that people do not always act in a rational and controlled manner, and that other people get hurt in the process. And to bring this down to a more personal level, because that's after all what this show is about. Every time we brought in a guest, I always say, as you're listening, okay, fine, listen to what the guest has to say, but apply it to your own life so you can have daily benefit. And to me, this plane crash should be no different. Think about, just as I shared, when it went from a mechanical failure to a human malfunction, what it did to me, the feeling it had. I'm willing to bet that every one of you listening now had your own version of that transition. And while certainly not nearly as graphic, these kinds of things happen to every one of us all day long. A lot of them happen so fast and they're so minor, they sort of fall below our level of awareness. But when you take the basket of them for the day, they sure can explain why you go home pretty crabby at the end of the day, or why you pick a fight with your significant other, and it may not even come into your awareness that there was a linkage, and yet there was. Or, on the simplest level, this guy was obviously depressed. I'm sure we got a bunch of depressed people around here. There's all sorts of good reasons. They're everywhere, and most of us have at some point in our lives some depression. I just a couple of weeks ago went through major, still am, depression because of the death of a dog. You can say, oh, it's a dog, okay, you can get another dog. But it's about how we connect with the world around us. So if we can use this terrible event to learn to be a little more aware, first of all, aware that we all can be influenced by mental health. It's how our brain works. It's how our body's built. Anybody who thinks that mental health doesn't influence them has just proved they have a mental health problem. Your brain and whatever goes on inside that brain and how we feel and how we put things together is central to our being. So we have to understand that we make mistakes. Oh, sometimes we can say, oh, yeah, it's because I had a few too many beers. You know what? Okay, but to the person who was the recipient of that error, it didn't matter you had a few beers. What you said still hurt. Sometimes you don't have to have a couple of beers to make that same mistake. Sometimes you just wake up and it's a gray, cloudy day, and like we had a few weeks ago, it's been freezing and you've had it and got problems at work or financial problems or whatever it is, and you're going, I don't know why, but today just feels terrible. Or vice versa. I had a patient who was in yesterday, and we tried a new medicine on this person, and I talked to him this morning. He said, oh, my God, overnight, and I had to say, okay, that's great, but let's wait and see what happens. Because as humans, we like to try to rethink we're in control. And this may sound really like a negative objective, but it's important to remember we're only in control to a certain extent. And we got to learn to be comfortable with that. And most people, let's deal with parent-child. Most people want the best for their kids. Even if you look at their parenting style and go, ooh, boy, that's tough. On some level, they're doing what they think is right for their kids. Okay, there are exceptions, but let's just say that's the lion's share. It doesn't always work out as we plan. I had a new patient yesterday who was sitting telling me about how his father can't stand certain lifestyle characteristics that are him. He says, I think my father loves me, but he hates who I am. How do you reconcile that? And why is he in? He says, because I know I need to make sense out of that, even though that statement kind of doesn't make any sense. He hates everything that I am, but he loves me because I'm his son. Can't be. Help me be able to live with that. So, okay, there is a very, granted for him, huge issue, but it's a parallel example of we've got to deal with the fact that we are not totally in control. We cannot predict what's going to happen from one moment to the next, and unfortunately, Lou, you are reminded of that when you go to get on a jetway.
Right.
It doesn't bother you when you get into your car to drive to work on a snowy morning, which is probably statistically more dangerous.
Well, I just took a trip to D.C., and I can't tell you how many times I thought to myself and chuckled about how much more dangerous this drive is than being on a plane, and yet I don't even blink about it. I don't give it a second thought.
So if there's a takeaway, it's not only how this influences us, but it would be good if we could be sensitive to how this influences others. Since drugs use is a big part of this program, I'm going to repeat something I've said before, and most of our listeners probably know. We unfortunately have such potent heroin and and not to mention the pharmaceutical opiates that are readily available, although heroin more so, in our midst, that many people innocently, okay, maybe foolish, but nevertheless innocently get addicted the first time. Hey, I'm an example of that. I never wanted to turn my life upside down after doing everything I had done to become a doctor, to become a good husband and a father and cause all the trouble. And my life changed, in that one little thing. I look back now and I even though I recall it very clearly, I can't make any sense out of it. Now, I can beat the daylights out of myself and say, what was wrong with me? And that's that is a good question to ask, if for no other reason to make sure we don't walk that path again. Mm-hmm. But there's also something that we as humans do that an airplane can't do. And that is we can forgive, because, not to be pushing the pearls of wisdom again, but learning says, when I learn something and I look back to where I was before I learned it, that doesn't look so smart. And we learn every day. And if there's anything about this show today that I hope people take away, it's not that, here's another discussion about the Germanwings airplane and a disturbed co-pilot and how scary that is. I could really make everybody scared about how many people who are driving trucks on stimulants and have been up for too long, or how many people are driving cars under the influence of God knows what, or how many people who are angry and own guns. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on, and I'm not trying to pick on any one group. We just need to remember, and I hate to wax spiritual here, but there's something bigger than us out there. I personally believe whatever that bigger power is tries to bring about some positivity to keep these kinds of events to a minimum. But we need to remember that when people make mistakes, those of us who haven't made the mistakes kind of have a responsibility to help those people overcome those mistakes. And I'm sorry to say, when it comes to drug abuse, and when it comes to mental health issues, our society's got some learning to do. We're not real good on that front.
Well, when you think about the co-pilot, we spent a lot of time talking about it today, that co-pilot had a point in his life where whatever became this huge problem for him started out relatively small and in a way that can happen to anyone.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of what happens from that point on, which direction we all go in.
You make a very good point, because, once again, purely speculation. I'll bet you one day it went from being invisible to him to being, I'm not having a good day, I don't know why. And because, and the system unfortunately made it easy, because he kept it private, because he didn't respond, even though he went for help, he didn't respond to what the help said. It quietly got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it obviously got to, drastic proportions. And the parallels between that and drug abuse, alcohol abuse, depression, I mean, it's hard to tell what the real numbers are of how many of us will experience, quote unquote, clinical depression, whatever that means. But they're at least in the 2/3 range, and my guess is quite a bit higher. And so you bring up a good point. We shouldn't be ashamed to share, especially with our loved ones, if we are having a problem. And yet there's something about our culture that says you should be strong enough that you shouldn't have to do that. It's interesting. I, right at this moment, am experiencing sciatica. Never had it before in my life. And those of you who have had it, you know, it really hurts. And on Sunday morning, for whatever reason, it hit a peak. And I was with my girlfriend, and I'm crying uncontrollably, like a 3-year-old who just had his favorite toy taken away. And nobody, because it was pain-based, was going to question that I was doing that. Right. It was more they felt sorry. Now, if I had just been crying because I was so depressed, same exact thing, same exact feelings, but for a different reason, you think the response would be the same?
No, of course not. Of course not. And it's, unfortunately, it's almost an automatic reaction because of sort of the way our society looks at it. I literally had that reaction, as I mentioned earlier, when the words mental health were associated with my fear of flying. My initial reaction, and it was almost an involuntary reaction.
Well, I think it's that personalization that it could be me.
Right. And was to almost want to deny that, you know, and that's a bad road to take.
Well, as you said, a road that is almost guaranteed to contribute to it becoming a bigger problem. And so maybe that's the big takeaway. You know, while this stuff is uncomfortable, while society reinforces us to not think about it, to maybe pretend it doesn't exist, out of sight, out of mind does not mean first of all, it's never really out of your mind. And secondly, it sure doesn't mean it's going to go away. And when it comes to substance abuse and mental health, 2 areas I know very well, I will guarantee you it will get worse. You know, if it was your house on fire, you wouldn't said, let's go to the pizza parlor, have a couple of slices, and see if we can figure out why the house is burning, and then we'll come back and deal with it. You'd never do that.
Or just say, I'm not going to think about the house and think the fire's going to go out.
Right. So to some extent, you know, we're saying we'll give more consideration to why my house is burning down than to my mental health, which is central to my functioning.
Dr. Russ Ferstandig, how do people get in touch with you or learn more about you?
Several ways. You know, the old-fashioned way, you can call me, 732-477-4470, or you can go to my website, Monmouth Behavioral Medicine Center, also we're undergoing a name change, so it's also MonmouthBehavioralMedicine.com, forget the center, or shorebehavioralmedicine.com. And then if you want to read things, go to the resources part, lots and lots of things, including each of the shows that we've done for Living Better.
Dr. Russ Ferstandig, I'm Lou Russo with another edition of Living Better. We'll see you this time next week on NewsTalk Radio, WOBM, AM 1160 and 1310.
This has been Living Better with Dr. Russ Ferstandig and Lou Russo. Join them again next Saturday from 11 a.m. to 12 noon to find out more about keeping mind and body healthy. Only on NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310. The proceeding was a paid program. The opinions contained within do not necessarily reflect those of the staff, management, or sponsors of NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310. NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310 is proud to present another great informational show this Saturday called Living Better with Dr. Russ. Dr. Russ Ferstandig is an expert in addiction medicine and psychiatry. Each week, co-hosts Dr. Russ and Lou Russo will take on some compelling topics in those fields. Tune in this Saturday from 11 a.m. to 12 noon to listen to Living Better with Dr. Russ, only on NewsTalk Radio, WOBM AM 1160 and 1310.